Boston Public Library. I'm Bob Seay, and welcome to our guest here at the library, and those of you watching on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please send us your comments and questions over the next half hour or so. And as you may know, once a month we talk transportation. Well, fixing, maintaining, and improving our transportation network will take money, but how much and who will pay? Well, that's the subject today, and our guests to discuss it are Lizzie Weyant, Director of Government Regulation for the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Welcome.
Thank you.
Richard Parr, Research Director at MassINC.
Thank you.
And Rick Dimino, CEO of A Better City.
Thank you.
Let's begin with you, Rick. How much money do we need to spend on our transportation system?
Well, it's been the kind of key question that's in front of us, especially as we go into this legislative session. And the good news is that the Senate President and the Speaker have kind of opened the door to look at a bold set of transportation solutions. And as a result, a number of us, including MAPC and the good work in terms of the survey research that Rich's firm does, and a number of colleagues across the Commonwealth have been actually engaged in thinking about that question because we want to make sure that we're setting the table in the appropriate way. So we set the table by looking at actually a Governor Commission report that looked at the future of transportation over the next 20 years. And if you started looking at putting some price tags to the recommendations that they made, like decarbonizing transportation, or making our transportation system resilient, or leaning in and making transit the #1 priority relative to the future mobility of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, or taking the effort to make sure that technology is a critical part of our future transportation system. If you start adding up the opportunities associated with kind of having a vision for our transportation system that's bold and robust and actually lends itself to kind of the economic, livability, environmental, and quality of life aspects of our Commonwealth, you start looking at bigger numbers. And when you add the state of good repair numbers to the equation, which is the numbers that relate to just keeping our system operating and maintained, what we did is we found that minimally, we need about $50 billion over the next 20 years. And we put it into 3 separate buckets. So first of all, we examined what the state of good repair requirements would be for our system. And that goes beyond the current investments that the Baker administration's put into the system. We're very pleased, for example, the governor put $8 billion in the transit system over the next 5 years, and that's good. But when we looked at the transit gap, as well as the roadway bridge and our roadway maintenance gap, it's another, and also, by the way, the good old Metropolitan Highway System, which is affectionately referred to as the Big Ding and many other pieces associated with it, that was a $10 billion gap just in taking care of that existing system. And that's over the next 20 years. So then you start looking at some of these aspirational ideas. For example, building out a transit system. So in fact, it is the kind of system that we need to support our economy, connectivity, equity, issues around environmental sustainability. Well, when we look at the capital requirements associated with that transit space, what the transit system needs to be in the future, and those capacity opportunities, well, then we looked at that, and that was another at least a $10 billion. And then we started looking at, okay, what do we really need to do relative to decarbonization and resiliency? Like recently there was a proposal to take the regional rail system and electrify it. And what do we need to do to decarbonize and make our transportation system better and also then expand the system? Well, that was another $30 billion. And I want to put that in context because Seattle just agreed to over a $50 billion program. That's just a regional plan. Mm-hmm. Los Angeles has over $100 billion that they're looking at. And these are regional plans. Toronto, again, big numbers, regional plans. Mm-hmm. We're looking for a statewide proposal to come up with $50 billion. That's for the entire state. And by the way, the entire state needs support. Mm-hmm. And our colleagues on this panel know a lot about this, which is, for example, the RTAs in Worcester, the RTAs in Pioneer Valley, the RTAs throughout the Commonwealth, which are regional transit agencies. They're desperately looking for ways to better improve the connectivity of those regions and connections. We're looking for ways to connect to affordable housing in Brockton and Worcester and other parts of the Gateway City community, which Rich's firm spent a lot of time thinking about. We can't do that if we're just going to sit on our hands and use the existing dollars that we have.
Because I think the public gets mixed messages sometimes. We hear the governor say, we don't need to spend any more money on the cheap. What is he talking about there? Lizzie?
So, I think if you ask the average transit rider, do you think that this system needs more money? And Rich will talk to this because he has the actual numbers on it. People will say yes. It is obvious that the system needs more money. But then, recently we had this safety report. It makes it very clear that we definitely need more dollars just to make the system more safe, and that's sort of a basic need. Rick talked a little bit about the idea of how we make the system itself more resilient to climate change. That can't be aspirational, that's a have to have. And we don't have dollars right now to bake in to make sure that the entire transportation system, and that's roads and our transit system, is actually going to be able to be resilient to climate change. We don't have enough people working at MassDOT and MBTA to actually move projects across the finish line. That's not billion-dollar project level amounts of money that we need, but we need to pay more people to be working at MassDOT at the T. And then again, I think there are big things that we could do to actually address the commute times that people are experiencing, which have only skyrocketed over the last several years. And so I think, those are sort of the four things I think of as why it's pretty obvious that we need more money into the system. I think those are inarguable.
Mm-hmm. And Rich, you have done polling, MassINC has done polling about how people think this need should be paid for. What have they told you?
Yeah, so last year we did 4 public polls that were funded by the Barr Foundation about transportation, and they started in the spring kind of framing the problem. And we found that, particularly in the Boston area, people who are trying to commute to work are encountering some really high levels of frustration, so much so that significant minorities, a quarter to a third, are talking about changing jobs or even leaving the region altogether because things are so bad. They do support, some of these bigger ideas that Rick and Lizzie have been talking about. So we did a poll about rail and what could be done with the rail system. And people support doing a regional rail program, which is basically, to put it in layman's terms, making the current system, instead of funneling everybody into Boston in the morning and back out at night, making it run a little bit more like the subway system, so you could go back and forth, and that you would change sort of the way that people travel a little bit. They support that idea. They support electrifying the system. The most recent poll that we did in November, so this was before the safety report came out, found that people get it. 70% of them think that urgent action is needed, and 3/4 think that some kind of revenue needs to be generated. The question, of course, is how are you going to do that? Mm-hmm. And we tested a bunch of different options that have been sort of proposed and put on the table by some of the groups that have been meeting over the course of last year to talk about this, from a 15-cent increase in the gas tax to tolls and various things. And what you find is that those sorts of things are less popular than 3/4. I mean, they're kind of more 50-50, depending on how you ask.
I think we actually have some of the statistics from your poll.
Yeah, exactly. So the most popular thing we tested was not something that people would be paying out of their own pockets. It would be the idea of having, if you're going to build a real estate project, say near a highway interchange or near a T station, let's have that real estate project, let's have that company chip in a little bit for the development of the infrastructure that's going to serve that particular piece of real estate that they're doing. So that's a popular idea. In general, I would say people would rather find somebody else to pay for this stuff than themselves, and that's just human nature, right? So when people see numbers like 49% on the gas tax or 42% on the gas tax, depending on how we're talking about it, that's not a shocking number. That's not to be unexpected. I think the thing to think about in terms of talking about this problem is not so much to focus on the big number, but it's to focus on what are you going to do with that money? What are you going to do to actually improve people's lives? People are telling us that they know that the system is in poor shape. They're frustrated with their commutes, particularly in the greater Boston area. Support for doing something and support for some of these revenue ideas is higher. You get majority support for the gas tax if you're just looking inside Route 128, which is very interesting. So Rick mentioned the idea that some other states are tackling this as a regional problem. I think the numbers suggest that there would be some support for doing it here as well, because people in the Boston area are experiencing transportation and telling us in the polling that they're experiencing transportation in a very different way than people in other parts of the state. I live in Northampton, Massachusetts now, and out there we're just kind of worried about our bridges and potholes and keeping the roads up when it's cold and snowy. Here it's about congestion, it's about the T falling apart, people not feeling that they can rely on the T as an alternative to the congested roads.
Mm-hmm. One of the graphics up there was about how people feel about discounted tolls on the Pike, and 73%, another positive figure, was for that. a lower amount. I think it was 46% support increasing tolls during peak hours. That's less than a majority, of course. So that gives some sense of what people feel about so-called congestion pricing.
Right, exactly. Again, not shocking they would be happy to pay less. They'd be less happy to pay more. The governor has also proposed this idea of kind of taking a lane on existing highways and turning that into a tolled lane. This is something that's done in other states where you can kind of adjust the price of that toll to sort of keep the traffic in that lane moving, and then by taking cars out of the other lanes, you're sort of helping the traffic there as well. And that was actually a proposition that got majority support in this poll. So, so some manner of congestion pricing, it seems there's some support for some parts of it, maybe less so for other things. I know some of the advocates for the discount idea are just saying, let's just try it. Let's do it as a pilot and see what happens. If it makes a difference, it doesn't. We'll at least have some data to sort of go by and see if it works. People are more optimistic, I would say, about fixing the T than they are about fixing traffic. With the T, they tell us it's a management issue, it's a lack of funding. We see that the infrastructure could be better. We see that the management could be better. With the roads, I think there's a feeling of like, this is just the economy. People want to get into Boston. They see the cranes going up. They see the buildings going up. They see this sense of everyone kind of wants to funnel into Boston. And unless we deal with some of the way that we do development and housing in this region, that's going to kind of continue. So they kind of see that as a little intractable.
Well, Emily Chariot, who works here at BPL, went out and talked to some people and found out what they think about some of these ideas for raising money.
What are your thoughts on the potential for congestion pricing or a gas tax?
I just think people should be taking more public transportation, and less traffic the better, and more walking and more free space.
No, I think that I'm in favor of anything that might help with the traffic in Boston, and congestion pricing seems like it might be the most fair way to make people who are using the services and coming into the city pay their fair share for it.
I mean, I don't drive into Boston often, but I wouldn't mind paying if it will help get some people off the road. So yeah, I think it would be a good idea.
I'm still thinking about it. I think we got to do something, and I think all of the above may be necessary. And we've inherited one of the oldest system of transportation in the country, and we've grown fast. And there's a price you pay for that, and we have to suck it in and pay the price and get it done.
And on the subject of tolls, there was one person who told us that they may have supported tolling more highways, but they worried about some of the unintended consequences.
People who take the Tobin already do get charged, so I feel like if they started tolling 93, 95, all the other routes into the city, you might see more congestions in more rural areas for the back road people trying to avoid the tolls. So the benefit for the big main highways, sure, but the back roads might suffer for it.
So some of the thoughts of real people out there who have to deal with the traffic every day. Lizzie, I know on Beacon Hill they're saying, the Transportation Committee is saying that they're hoping or expecting to come up with some kind of plan actually this month. What are you hearing?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I love all of those people that you interviewed, and I want them to come with me to the State House to talk to their legislators, even the guy who's a little bit worried about rural congestion, because like Rick said, we have to address rural transportation issues too as we're thinking about our transportation issues statewide. I think we have heard that the Transportation Committee is working very closely with the chair of Ways and Means and some other folks in the leadership team to really think about what a transportation package would look like. We've heard gas tax could be in the mix. We've heard fees on transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft could be part of the mix. I think some of the challenges that you're facing in the State House are challenges that we've faced before. Like Rich said, gas tax is never something that people go into a debate thinking, oh my gosh, I love that. I totally want to pay more in gas tax. So I think we're prepared for that. And I think I think part of what we have to talk about is how we achieve some more statewide parity so that we can make sure that we're making investments statewide so other people feel like they're actually getting something. There's a return on their investment if the gas tax is going to go up. I think some of these local option ideas that you've talked about, and we categorize that as value capture, the opportunity for cities and towns to raise local taxes. I think that also needs to be part of the mix, because that's a little bit about how you get to that regional approach, is allowing cities and towns to actually raise local money to invest in local projects. The Senate has been supportive of those measures in the past, particularly regional ballot initiatives. I feel like everything's kind of on the table right now, and I feel like a lot of us are really poised to try to move things across the finish line. We've heard that the House will do something soon. Fingers crossed that that's true. And then I think there's this question of what and when the Senate will take it up. And then I think, the other challenge is that there are a number of different legislative vehicles that are potentially on the table. I think there's funding and financing legislation, and then potentially legislation that looks at how we govern the MBTA, and maybe even some changes that could be made at MassDOT or at the RTAs. So there's a lot of moving pieces in the State House.
Well, we've been waiting a long time, and the feeling is that something is about to happen. Rick, do you have any idea what that might be?
Well, one of the things that I really appreciate from the interviews that you did on the street is this notion and the conversation regarding roadway pricing and the conversation regarding congestion pricing. And, being involved with the subject for a number of years, what we've always seen is that there's been a regular and routine debate about the toll and the toll price. And that's been reasonable, just as the gas tax. People sometimes have visceral reaction to these kinds of things. But, public dialogue and policy dialogue and leadership and kind of the House and Senate leadership talking about regional equity in our toll system and actually looking at roadway pricing. And Rich was talking about roads and transit. And this is actually on the context of roadway pricing. This is where these two things come together. And my colleagues know, and I know we've talked about this before, roadway pricing in other parts of the United States actually supports transit. Meaning where we get $1 from the roadway and we actually invest it in transit. One of my favorite things is in the Golden Gate Bridge, and when we pay toll to go over the bridge, it pays for the water transportation and the bus service. The same thing's true in the Lincoln Tunnel. So we need to start thinking about roadway pricing in so many different ways. And right now, believe it or not, a toll that's collected here in Massachusetts can only be used for the acid for which it's collected. And we can't even issue debt on that toll. Meaning we can't we want to build this, I think, incredibly city building project in Austin.
Right.
The Austin Interchange. We don't have a single dollar for construction. If I wanted to take a loan out on those toll dollars, I can't do that now to help pay for that project. So we need to reimagine, if you will, and kind of, I like the lady that said all of the above.
Yeah, well, I think she's on
Right?
something.
I might put her on my staff. She really got it right, because we actually have to think about this in a comprehensive way. And the good news, getting back to this legislative strategy, is when we go and talk to the Senate President, Speaker's office, and the leadership teams associated with this, there's actually an open ear and a willingness to kind of consider these types of things. And again, I think it lends itself to this notion of doing it in a comprehensive way, and that kind of a lot of people are all in, meaning that we need to do something about the Brocktons of the world. We need to do something about the Worcesters and the Springfields of the world. It's unimaginable to think that we're going to have a transportation finance plan that just takes care of Boston, because legislators represent all of the constituencies of this state. And if we think that we're going to do it that way, and by the way, I happen to be a big fan of the city of Boston, but I am a bigger fan of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts when it comes to a transportation finance strategy, because all of these areas of the Commonwealth need attention. And again, as Richard was saying, when I look at structurally deficient bridges, they're all over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Right.
When I'm looking at roadway conditions, those are conditions that are unfortunately unacceptable all over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. When I'm looking at the cost of what it's taking people to come into the city of Boston or economic centers throughout the state because their transportation costs have gone up, that's a statewide issue. So we need to kind of look at this in a comprehensive way. Again, the key point that I'm actually emphasizing, by the way, our $50 billion strategy, 50% of that revenue stream is related to a roadway pricing strategy and directly relates to the notion of toll equity. For example, our colleagues and the legislators that have had represented the North Shore, for example, or the northern part of the state that pay on I-90, that pay to get over the Tobin Bridge, or they pay to get through the Callahan and Sumner Tunnel, or the Ted Williams Tunnel, or they pay on the Turnpike. They're getting tired of just being the only people that pay. And we all know that gas tax revenues, even if we raise the money, it's going to eventually go down because we're going to move hopefully to electric vehicles. So roadway pricing is kind of a critical part of our future, as well as an important part of how we deal with issues around greenhouse gas reduction and how we deal with congestion. So we hope that that's a piece of this legislation going forward.
Lizzie.
Yeah, the one other piece I think it's really important to mention is that when we think about sort of where we've been historically with tolling versus where we've been on MBTA fares, is that MBTA fares have increased astronomically in the same period of time that tolls actually haven't increased very much at all. So one of the things that we haven't touched on very much, but we actually are all sort of deeply involved with, is this idea of equity and sort of how our transportation system affects the lowest income people across the entire Commonwealth. That's true in our urban centers, and again, it's true in rural communities as well. And so I think it's something that we really have to think about, is that MBTA riders have been asked over and over and over again to pay more for a system that hasn't actually given them much in return. And there's sort of a fundamental unfairness to that. And then the other piece I think it's just worth mentioning is that when we do research and kind of look across the country at all of our other sister cities that are major metropolitan areas that have a big legacy transit system, so an old transportation system, old roads, kind of an older city, they all have some form of increased tolling and even congestion pricing. And so just when we think about sort of best practices in our field, it's kind of one of the ways that we really need to be looking.
Yeah.
Just a note to those of you here at the WGBH studio at the library and those of you watching on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, we'd love to hear your comments and questions. I'd like to get to what I think is a central issue here, which is people will favor paying more for transportation if they can be assured that the money will be spent on transportation. What about that trust factor, Rich? What do your polls tell you about that?
I mean, it's a huge issue. I think of this in transportation public opinion, we are sort of living under the hangover of two things from the 1980s. One of them is the Taxachusetts label, which I think a lot of people who look at budgets and policy would say that that's increasingly inaccurate about Massachusetts. We actually are not as high a tax state as many people think that we are. The second thing is the big dig. And that comes up every time I do a focus group about transportation. Somebody in that room brings up the big dig, and they bring it up in a negative context. They bring it up in the context of like, I don't trust that this thing is going to get done. The money's going to go down a sinkhole, and I'm never going to see it again. We've done focus groups out in the western part of the state where I live. People think I'm paying the sales tax back to the T, and I'm never seeing any benefit of that.
And people should know that a good part of the sales tax, $1 billion a year, goes to the MBTA, no matter where you're buying things.
And that is very acutely felt and known outward in other parts of the state. So the management issue is definitely a challenge. And the last poll that we did, the most recent poll, the one that we did the revenues in, we actually asked people about various priorities for transportation, and then we asked them to rank them. And what we found is that even though people think it's really important to improve the management, to do better on, how we spend the money, to sort of expedite things, when you ask them to rank it, they still want to spend the money. It's a little bit of a mixed message, but I would say what they're saying is, yeah, we know that there are issues with accountability. Yeah, we know that there are issues with management, but the crisis has gotten so bad, again, particularly in the Boston area, that we need to kind of push through it. We can't just wait until that is solved and then go ahead and spend the thing. We need to be doing both at the same time. And I'd say that, in terms of management, it can also be thought of as a bit of a selling point. When we did some focus groups about this regional ballot concept, this is the idea that different regions of the state or cities or groups of cities could come together and decide on a set of policies or projects and then vote for, say, like an increase in a local sales tax or a local tax of some kind in order to fund those things. That's done in a lot of other parts of the state. They're not really done here as much. It's in fact not done at all. One of the top message for that, the top argument for that we tested in these focus groups was accountability. It wasn't that this is going to unlock some project that's been stuck because Beacon Hill can't come up with the money for it or won't agree to it. It's because they felt that if we have a local vote and local control, and we're picking the projects, and we know what the money source is, and we know where that's going, and we have some sense of who to blame if it doesn't go through, that was the top message. So it's something that needs to be folded into this entire conversation and all of these packages. It's not something that should hold people up, I think, from acting, but it needs to be acknowledged and kind of treated as part of the problem.
What about that, Lizzie? How do you build that trust on Beacon Hill?
I think there is support inside the State House for the idea of these regional ballot initiatives, for allowing cities and towns to think about how they raise money locally and then spend money locally. I think there's a lot more support from that from our municipal leaders. The mayors and managers that we work with in the 101 cities and towns that my agency serves have taken a position in support of regional ballot initiatives. And I think building that trust inside the State House is actually kind of sending that message that when we raise money locally, it's actually going into a lockbox it's reinvested in those communities. And it is just unequivocally the way transportation is funded throughout the entire rest of the country. The $100 billion number that Rick mentioned in the beginning that LA is moving towards, a lot of that is actually funded through a regional ballot initiative. And our hands are tied in Massachusetts that we can't actually raise money this way.
That's Rick.
No, the question that you're raising is really key in many ways because good colleagues in the community are looking at, for example, the millionaire's tax and the relationship of kind of general taxes like income taxes, corporate taxes, et cetera. And when they talk about that idea, they talk about the notion of education and transportation as being the relationship to that kind of approach to revenue streams. When we look at the relationship to transportation, however, what we see is transportation-sourced revenues is actually the better way to go for transportation. And I think that's an important thing for the listeners to really understand. And the reason why is because, the first point that you made, this lockbox notion of transportation resources. When we created the new Department of Transportation, the legislators did, we all got a chance to say what our 2 cents were on it. But when that was created, we actually created trust funds and real specific kind of banks, if you will, within the transportation organization, where dollars from tolls and dollars from different sources can actually go into the transportation agency. So today we can actually craft legislation. The gas tax constitutionally goes into transportation. But today, if we looked at roadway pricing, we can actually make sure it goes into transportation. If we look at TNC fees, we can actually put those dollars into transportation. So transportation source revenues going into transportation is much more likely than kind of a general tax strategy. Second point is that when you look at transportation source pricing, you can start looking at behavior changes and climate change. So say, for instance, I can start creating incentives for electric vehicles. I can create incentives for congestion pricing. I can choose to try to change shifts and mode splits to transit by creating pricing changes, as Lizzie has said. I mean, we're contemplating legislation where we take roadway pricing and subsidize and discount transit fares, right? Great idea. I mean, you've heard recently, let's make the buses free.
Right.
So you can, when you're in the world of transportation pricing and transportation source revenue, you can create fundamental change in policy and behavior that's really important. So I'm so glad you asked that question because I wanted to emphasize that those are the kind of outcomes that relate to this.
And all of your language is conditional. We can do this.
Right, yes.
Will we?
My hope
What's your guess?
I think we're going to move the needle substantively this year.
Do you agree, Lizzie?
I don't think we have a choice. I mean, there's a real cost associated with not investing in our transportation system. There's sort of the day-to-day cost of people actually not being able to get to jobs, people living so far from where they actually work, and they're spending 2-4 hours a day just sitting in the car. And then there's sort of that like human cost and economic cost. And then again, if we don't make these investments to make the system more resilient to climate change, there's public health implications to that, and then really just shutting down the transit system if we're not actually meeting those needs.
Yeah.
Lisa,
it's a should.
Lisa on Facebook said, what needs to happen in the legislature to get this done? What's it going to take? This is the frustration I think people feel, and you're kind of addressing that. But do you think there is enough pressure, and do you think there is enough agreement to actually have something happen?
I think there's real momentum towards it right now. I really feel like all of these reports, it's in the news every single day, that there's enough of a push. And I think it's really statewide to actually push our elected officials to do something. And like Rick said, to do something bold.
Yeah. We've seen it over the course of just this year in the polling that we've released publicly. In the spring, that number that I'd cited earlier, action urgently needed, it was 60%. By November, it was 70%. And the percentage of people who thought that the T was in poor shape went from 15% in the spring to 30.
Wow.
And what happened in between there? The red line derailed.
Right.
So these events that are getting covered in the news I think are having an impact on people's opinion. And I would say from a public opinion perspective, I can't say how that translates into the legislature, but it does seem like as if people are kind of reaching a bit of a breaking point in terms of this.
Bob, the other point too is that with working with my colleagues here and others, statewide, there's business associations that have come forward, whether it's the Worcester Chamber of Commerce, the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce, or Boston Chamber of Commerce, of course, the Better City, organizations like the Massachusetts Business Roundtable, coming forward and saying now's the time to move forward on a very bold set of transportation revenues. We have transportation advocacy groups that we're all affiliated with that are relate to activists, relate to residents, relate to real people that really care about this. Those advocacy communities are aligned. We're seeing environmental community aligned. So you're seeing great alignment of significant stakeholders also weighing in with legislators saying, we want you to move in a bold way this year.
Of course, anybody who follows the MBTA on Twitter knows about all of the personal complaints that people constantly register about the conductor not collecting fees, about the train being late or broken down. Is it possible that people do have these immediate personal concerns? Do you think they get the bigger picture?
I mean, I think so. I'll give you an example. When we do polling, we've done some polling in the Boston area where we ask people, about congestion. What's the single biggest policy thing that we could do to improve congestion? And what they say is fix the T. They get the relationship between these two things. Now, I don't know if that necessarily translates into saying that they want their gas tax to go to, making T fares lower. I'm not sure if that it's quite there yet, but they understand the relationship that they can't. We're not going to do another big dig. We're not going to widen these roads and put more people into them. We need to get people off of the roads and onto public transit. And the only way to do that is to make transit more reliable. It's going to be hard. I mean, we asked people in a poll, who don't take transit, why don't you take it? And the number one thing they said is, I just like having my car. I want to be able to run an errand or get my kid from daycare or something like that. That's the top thing. There are other things that we could do below that could maybe capture some of those people. But it is a cultural issue that's going to have to change. But right now, a lot of people are also using the excuse that the T is not reliable, it doesn't run frequently enough, it's too expensive. All of those things are things that we can address that could then go towards the issue of maybe getting people to feel like they'd be a little more comfortable not having their car.
Do we have the political leadership who's articulating this? Who is leading this? I get a feeling that the governor is in one position, the legislature is in another. There's some kind of disagreement about gas taxes. I don't get a feeling that there's a unified leadership here, which I think is going to be needed.
I think there are a number of different perspectives about the how, but I think that there is support for the fact that we need to do something and what we need to be making investments in. It's the first time in the 12 years I've been doing this work that we're actually talking about transportation not as its own siloed thing, that we talk about the impact that transportation has on housing and on climate. And so that actually opens the door, I think, inside the State House to get more people involved in thinking about how we're actually solving this. And so I think you're right that there's some questions about what the right mechanism is, what the right set of mechanisms are, what the public is going to potentially be supportive of or really not like at all. But there is support for this idea that we have to make an investment. And then the one other thing I'll add is that some of these things, that the idea that people really just love their cars, technology is starting to shift that. There are more opportunities to kind of get goods and services and get around. And I do think that you will start to see the impact of that about how we think about how we're funding our transportation system too.
Hey, Rick.
I just want to mention the first point, which is, folks day to day and what they think about our transportation system and their own personal experience and how that might relate to political change. I can tell you the employer community is hearing across the board from their workforce that the transportation system's not working for them. And as Richard alluded to earlier, surveys that he's done as well as others like Mass Biotech are suggesting that the workforce is starting to think about going somewhere else. Now the workforce, and Lizzie, because I sit on our board, has done extensive work at looking at workforce and skilled labor in relationship to the needs of our economy to move forward. It's a sensitive balancing issue, meaning our economy is one of the strongest economies in the Northeast right now, And if we can't keep our workforce and we can't keep them happy and want them to stay here in Massachusetts, we're going to lose our edge. And that workforce is directly saying to employers across the entire state that we're not happy. We're not happy about our community experience.
Well, it should be fascinating to see what transpires on Beacon Hill in the next few months. A lot of pressure and a lot of calls for change. So we should all get together in another 6 months and see what they've come up with.
Great.
I want to thank very much Rick Dimino, CEO of A Better City, Lizzie Weyant of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and Rich Parr of MassINC for talking about how to fund our transportation network, a subject that I'm sure we haven't completely covered today. It will go on and on and on, but it's important that people keep paying attention to what's happening on Beacon Hill because it will affect them and the future of transportation. Once again, thank you for joining us here at Lunch Hour Live at the Boston Public Library. I'm Bob Seay.